Welcome to Just Plain Wrong, the podcast where three Mennonite librarians chat about what the media gets right and wrong about the Amish and other plain groups. This week we'll be trying something new where we each review something that the other two haven't read, maybe because we didn't want to read them. I'll be reviewing some issues from the comic Punisher Max that feature an assassin called the Mennonite. Abby will be reviewing the infamous sci-fi novel Amish Vampires in Space, and Erin will be reviewing the YA book Crimson Born about an Amish girl who becomes a vampire. We're very excited. Because these books all feature kind of weird juxtapositions between Amish or Mennonites and vampires or assassins, I thought it would be interesting to ask what our most contradictory Mennonite moment is. Abby, do you want to start?
Sure. So I had to think about this for a while, and eventually I decided that maybe now is the time to tell the story about how I got an alcohol violation during my time at Goshen College. So I was originally planning on actually attempting to dig out the records and see what actually occurred from the college's perspective, if I could even do that before telling this story. But it definitely has some good contradictions in it. So to set the scene a little bit, I was a freshman and I was involved in a backstage production in the theater department. And as sometimes is the case at Goshen, after the production wrapped, there was a after party that took place off campus. And I went, and I had previously to that, up to that point, not gone to a party off campus. And so I went with a few friends and I tried a beer and I hung out, and I didn't end up super liking it. Mostly probably because I was very awkward, but I kind of decided, this isn't really what I want to do. So later on, I forget exactly the rationale, but I was talking to my RA. There had been, I think, an incident on the floor, and she was asking people about it. And so she was asking, I think, whether people had gone to this party. And I said, yeah, I went to that party. I tried a beer. I didn't really like it, but, I went, but I don't think I'm going to do it again. And she wrote me up. So I got to have a very awkward conversation with my advisor. Then I also got charged a $175 fee, which at the time felt astronomical. But the cast members, when they heard about what had happened, actually had another off-campus party to raise funds for me and to try to help me pay the fee. So that is my slightly contradictory Mennonite story of how I had an alcohol violation.
Okay. Mennonite college, alcohol violation, and then crowdsourced repayment for that. Very mutual aid.
It was.
Erin, how about you?
Well, mine also involves alcohol, but a couple years later, so I was out of college. But I graduated from Bluffton. I had a history major. I moved to Goshen to live with some friends, and I needed to find a job. And there weren't a lot of jobs, or maybe there were, but I didn't have any real good experience at that point. And so I found a job based on talking to some new friends I had made. And one of them was working at this place called Chalet Party Shop, a local liquor store. And I was like, are they hiring? And he said, yes. So I went in and gave my new friend's name, and they basically hired me on the spot. So that was nice. My first job after college was at a liquor store. And then in August, so a few months after starting this job, the position opened up at the MHL, and I interviewed, and I put this Chalet Party Shop on my resume. So and they hired me. And neither job paid great, but because of that, I actually worked both jobs for quite a while. So I worked at the MHL for 4 years, and I think I continued working at the liquor store for about 2 of those 4 years. So that's my contradictory thing. I needed to make money. I found a way to do it. I worked at the MHL, but I also worked at the liquor store.
I guess that brings me to my most contradictory Mennonite moment, which is that I took 8 years of dance lessons, but I did it with my cousins. So it was also,
What kind of dancing?
Ballet. Though for a while I did do acro and tap. Kind of wish I'd stuck with tap, actually. Tap is fun. I have retained almost nothing from those 8 years, except for a handful of French verbs and fond memories of certain dance recital songs. All right. So let's get into some summaries and descriptions for our 3 different books. Abby, why don't you start?
All right. So I read the book Amish Vampires in Space by Carrie Nietz, N-I-E-T-Z. Nietz, I'm going to say. This was an interesting read. It's almost 500 pages, which might be why Tillie and Erin decided to stop reading this book. So I'll provide a kind of overarching. Obviously, we read this because this is actually it's a really well-known book. The title is obviously the title kind of says it all, like Amish Vampires in Space. And actually, when I was looking up about this, I went to the author's website, and apparently this has actually been a joke on Jimmy Fallon. Like, so it's gotten some nationwide attention. So this starts off on the planet of Alabaster, which has been colonized by the Amish several generations previously. So they colonized it, and then obviously using other people's technology to get there, and then they had made it into kind of an Amish colony that you would see today. So similar lack of technology. Our main character, Jebediah, though, has been using this secret technology passed down from his father and his father's father that leads him to discover that something is wrong with their son. He doesn't know exactly what it is, but he knows something is wrong. And he uses some of this same tech to trigger what turns out to be a rescue beacon that is picked up by a passing large cargo ship captained by a man named Seal. And so the ship arrives, and to the surprise of the Amish colony, who had no idea that Jebediah had been doing this, and of course no idea until this giant ship shows up.
When you say sun, do you mean like the solar star, or do you mean S-O-N, like his child?
Oh, S-U-N, there. That would be the... Yeah, so Jebediah has no children, so there is no exploding children in this book. So this large cargo ship arrives, and the bishops of this Amish colony have to decide whether to take the word of these English people and leave all of their life behind and go to some new planet that they're going to be provided with.
By who?
And so what?
Who's providing the planet?
Oh, this is another interesting thing. So the reason they're doing it is they don't know exactly who, but essentially this is someone when they were first colonizing got insurance, which actually makes sense. Like I can envision in a world where you're colonizing strange planets and places, like to get insurance for your colony to say, hey, if this one falls apart, we get another one. Makes sense. And also would be something the Amish would maybe not do. So spoiler alert, it turns out that the person whose previous, father, because all this was several generations back, the person whose family did this turned out to be the ultra conservative Samuel Bishop, who is kind of the foil to Jebediah. So anyways, so the bishops of the colony debate whether to leave. They are very distrustful of the cargo ship crew and initially plan to stay on their doomed planet. They don't want to leave. However, Jebediah goes against their instructions and gives a speech to the gathered Amish and persuades them that they need to leave their doomed planet and get on board this giant ship. So he is shunned as a result of this, but the Amish do decide to go. So they all get on board the ship, and turns out the cargo ship is also carrying the remains and cryogenically frozen sole survivor of a experimental research lab that has some kind of deadly fire explosion, something or other. So, spoiler alert, as you might have guessed, the remains of that lab were not entirely dead, and soon there are vampire stalking the cargo ship. So the vampires, they quickly realize that the Amish make very easy targets due to their general, they're not familiar with the ways of the ships. They're very distrustful of the English, and so they don't report things that seem suspicious. And this is also probably my least favorite part of the book, and it lasts quite a while. which is basically, as I call it, the horror section, which is felt like half the book, is basically vampires using mind control and seduction, which made me very uncomfortable because I don't like that aspect of vampires, and it makes for some very iffy consent stuff that I found icky. So let's just fast forward and say that it takes Seal, the captain of the ship, a very long time to notice that anything is wrong. And by the time he realizes there has been a problem, most of the crew, including the pilots of the ship and the majority of the Amish refugees, have been turned into vampires or captured by them. So this is where the plot takes up speed and kind of takes on more of the components of traditional sci-fi. Jebediah and a few of the other Amish end up working with Seal and a handful of the remaining crew to retake the ship. They kill the first, which is kind of the name for the powerful vampire who originates this, I don't know what you call a group of vampires, a pod, a bloody murder, I don't know what you call it. Anyways, who is also kind of controlling the other. So due to the very small number of survivors, Jebediah and a few of the other Amish abandon their belief of non-resistance in order to fight the vampires. Eventually, they are successful.
Was there some sort of like internal debate, or it was just like, we have to do this? Let's kill people.
No, there was extensive debate. Thanks to our friend Samuel, who,
oh yeah, Samuel
represents that conservative side. It is not brushed away. It is a point of tension. So eventually they are successful. However, in a final twist, the real first vampire is revealed and is only stopped when the ultra-conservative Bishop Samuel, who has been like Jebediah's main source of conflict, stakes her in the heart. Da, da, da. And the book ends with the vastly reduced group of highly traumatized Amish refugees arriving in their new home to begin the work of rebuilding a new colony. And I think by this point, I think at the end, I don't know, I kind of forget actually at the end if Jebediah is no longer shunned or they're just like, hey, hardly anyone's left, why don't you come with us?
I didn't get far enough into my reading of the book, but is Alabaster like only Amish people, the planet?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, this is a question. I had a question about numbers. So I mean, this is a very large cargo ship, but it is clearly like they're not going and picking up like district after district after district of Amish. Like we're talking like a couple hundred at most. So I get the sense that this planet is fairly empty except for this one. So it's like one Amish colony on the planet as opposed to a fully populated planet of Amish people, if that makes sense.
That does not bode well for the future genetic health of their colony at the end of the book. I'm a little worried.
That is a
something
very
I
good
worry
question.
about.
I will say this is the first in a trilogy, so maybe they deal with that in parts 2 or 3, although it does sound like they might be busy dealing with zombies and or werewolves. So I don't know. Maybe it'll marry with the werewolves and get some genetic diversity that way. I have no idea.
We can hope.
So how did the vampires work? Because I have to talk about that in my book too. Like, did they, like, could you, like, basically, did people get turned with one bite? Did they have to, like, did they have the option to kill people, but they just turned them all into vampires instead?
That's good. So it's interesting because as you follow along, the first vampire actually discovers his ability to kind of turn by turning animals. He's been feeding off of animals and he notices one that he like brings almost to the brink of death and he leaves and he's like, oh, well, that one will be dead by the time I come back. And when he comes back, the goat or sheep, I think, is like alive and kicking, has become a vampire goat.
Mm-hmm. And the fine tradition of Banicula.
Yeah.
Did you have to read that in grade school? I loved it. I thought it was great.
No.
It's about a vampire rabbit that drains life out of vegetables.
Oh, nice.
Oh man, you 90s kids got better stuff to read than we did in the 80s.
Well, so the premise behind the vampires is that basically, essentially that experimental research lab was, crossing bats with humans, that kind of thing, and it was the result of that got included in the cargo, and that's how it spread from there. So it is seen as essentially the vampires are a creation of science gone wrong. Although interesting, in terms of vampire mythology, 2 things that I found fascinating. One, they did go with the traditional like sunshine hurts the vampires. Mm-hmm. So their plan for getting rid of a bunch of vampires is to get them all into one cargo bay and like open up the shielding So like they're exposed to the solar light that's in space, I guess. Although the way they're traveling, I'm not sure. They were getting close to the planet at that point, so maybe that's when they were going to finally be around the sun. However, the way they were going to get the vampires there was by manufacturing a synthetic hormone based on. So one of the Jebediah's wife is pregnant in this, and they play off that. There is apparently some, I don't know, maybe minor questionable scientific evidence, but sometimes when women get pregnant, animals around them react to it and don't want to be around them because of the hormone they're giving off. And so the premise here is that the vampires don't like the hormones of, or the smell of a pregnant woman. So they flood the ship with that to drive the vampires into the one cargo bay so they can kill them all with the sunshine.
But the question that's has been concerning me since I made it all of 4 chapters into this book was, do the vampires have souls and personalities? Because as I think we've discussed in other episodes, there are Amish people who hunt. And I can see that violence against an animal or a creature without a soul or a mind wouldn't require Amish people to break their faith tradition of non-resistance. But, you know, if these vampires do seem to have a soul or a personality or, you know, willpower or anything that signals that they're capable of higher thought, then you'd run into issues.
Yeah, it definitely kind of seems like they still keep their soul. In fact, one of the things I didn't like, so in the big section that I didn't like where essentially the vampire is feeding on the Amish and like peeling off bits of them, is that, I'm not peeling off of, not literally bits of them. The Amish is like seducing some of them and turning them into vampires. Is that those, it leads to some because the vampire controlled / it's not quite clear whether they've just been fully vampireized or they're just being controlled by the other vampire, but they stay in the colony but start to lose their Amish ways. Like one of the big scenes of it turning is like Samuel, the poor conservative bishop, is looking around and people have started wearing bright colors, and the men and married women are consorting with other men, and it's like some weird sexual dynamics there too. I'm not quite sure. At some point, you're not really sure if they're talking about sex or if they're talking about biting each other. You know, with vampires, it's often kind of 6 of one, half a dozen of another. So in that way, it does seem like they are like corrupted, but still have a soul, is kind of the way it's played, I would say.
So if they're corrupted, can they serve as a food source for vampires later? Because if I were a vampire and I had a mind that was capable of higher functions, I'd be worried about turning all my food source into other vampires and then starving on a ship that had no pilot.
Well, they don't actually take everybody. They do turn some, but they have some that they end up kind of capturing. And they start by feeding on the livestock. So and their plan is, because this cargo ship is about to arrive at a planet. So the idea is they arrive at the planet. The planet doesn't know the vampires are coming. They get unloaded. And then the vampires now have a source of food that is an entire planet as opposed to just this ship.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Part of my problem with this book was inconsistent introduction of world building in the first several chapters. Like, it took me until chapter 4 to realize that Alabaster was a planet and not just a weird name for a town on Earth.
Yeah. So overall, in terms of accuracies and inaccuracies, I feel like there is a number of things that they got mostly right. I mean, the sci-fi world that they created had its own internal logic, mostly. And it was clear that the author had at least done some research about Amish. I also appreciated that their depiction of shunning was a little more accurate. I mean, it is included because I think it's very hard to write an Amish book that doesn't include some kind of shunning, but at least if it's written by non-Amish. But basically, Jebediah was kind of told where the line was in terms of what he was supposed to do with his behavior. He crossed it. So they said, hey, you're shunned. And he was basically told, essentially, in order, you just need to repent of your sin, say you were wrong in front of everybody, and we'll let you back. But of course, he doesn't feel like he was wrong because what he did that was wrong was, essentially saving the colony. Although, to be fair, this colony did end up getting decimated by vampires on the ship that he called. So, I mean, though, to be clear, if they'd stayed on the planet, all of them would have died, not just most of them. One of the interesting things was that one of the crew, so the future world is very secular, doesn't believe in romantic relationships. I mean, has some other kind of interesting things. However, one of the crew members is a secret Christian. And she does have some interesting interactions with her and Jebediah, including one where she tries to persuade Jebediah that the strict rules of the Amish aren't necessary since salvation is based on grace, not works, which is actually a fairly complex argument that is often used, I think, by people who actually try to convert Amish or see them as like a group needs to be converted. So that was kind of interesting to have in there. It was a bit of an oversimplification of Amish perspective. I think I did not appreciate the idea that abandoning the value of nonviolence is seen as required, and it kind of very quickly becomes like the characters who refuse to join the vampire hunt / fight are kind of viewed as selfish and definitely not the good guys, to put it that way. That said, I was impressed with the level of research that the author had done in trying to take kind of a current Amish society and imagine a future, get them into space, imagine what would happen. Yeah, so overall, I'd say the accuracy was better than I was expecting given the title.
Fair.
All right, Erin, you've got the next book about vampires, so why don't you describe your title next?
All right, you guys. I am really excited to talk to you about my vampire book, which was chosen very randomly, Crimson Born by Amy Patrick. I found it one night while searching Amazon for free books just by typing in the words Amish romance and sorting by free. And this one came up, and it is a young adult Amish romance vampire novel. So think Twilight, but Bella is Abigail, and she starts out Amish. So that's our premise here. So this book is set in modern times, but in a world where vampires are integrated into everyday life. And that is thanks to JFK and vampire leaders signing the Crimson Accord in the 1960s. I'll talk a little bit more about how the whole vampire things work here, but they do work differently. Like the vampire canon is a bit different than what Abby just described in Amish Vampires in Space. So our book starts at a Rumspringa party, and our main character is named Abby, which I think is funny after just doing a book about a Tillie. But anyway, we have Abigail Byler, and she's attending with 3 of her friends. And I appreciated this Rumspringa party because it felt like the right amount of rebellion. It had a bonfire, there was some beer, but no one was getting super wild. They were playing beer pong, playing some music. Yeah, it felt about right to me for a Rumspringa party. Not that I've ever been to one. But at this party, Abigail meets an English boy named Reese, and they sit on the hood of his car chatting. And though they've just met, there's this strong attraction, and she really likes him. And he asks for her number, and she's like, I don't have a phone, and it's kind of cute. Then in the buggy on their way home from the party, Abby and her friends are hit head on by a car, which happens to be Reese's car. And this part bothered me because they were coming from the same party, so I'm not quite sure why he was headed in a different direction. But anyway, it's a very serious accident. 2 of her friends die at the scene, but she and her friend Josiah survive. And Abigail, she goes by Abby, I'll use those interchangeably. She knows she's seriously injured and she's laying in the road, but this group of wanderers just happens to walk through, and it turns out they're vampires.
How useful.
Yes, exactly. And the vampire leader is named Imogen, and for some reason so the vampires, they go and drink the blood of the 2 that have died. But Abigail is still alive, and something about her speaks to Imogen, and so Imogen decides to turn Abigail into a vampire. And after Abby pleads with Imogen to do so, Reese, the driver of the car, is also turned into a vampire. He was very injured. His car is upside down in the ditch. And they hide her in a culvert for the night, and she wakes up in the morning kind of iffy about what happened, but she's healthy and strong and thankful to be alive.
Fascinating. Tell us more.
But I have a quick question there. So
Yes.
did they essentially... So she wanted to be turned into a vampire. So she thought death or vampirism. Is that where she thought she was headed?
So let me pause and talk briefly about the Crimson Accord and how vampires and humans can live and peace in this world. So one of the things in the Crimson Accord is that humans can only be turned into vampires if they give permission. And so Imogen had to get Abby's permission.
Consent is sexy.
Yes, consent is very sexy even when it has to do with being turned into a vampire. Vampires cannot drink animal blood in this world. It will give them blood poisoning. So that is a stark difference from basically any other vampire book, movie thing I've ever read. So because of the Crimson Accord and the fact they live in peace, humans, to do their part, donate blood regularly. And there are whole blood banks just set up for vampires to go and get their nutrition. And also, you don't turn into a vampire the first time someone like drinks from you. Like it takes like 15 times unless the vampire is super strong, which is an important note about our friend
Like Imogen is.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Imogen's a vampire queen, isn't she?
She is. And now Abby.
Ooh, does that make the Amish vampire queen heir?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Amish.
You know, if they had called that like, like Abby the Amish vampire queen, I would 100% read that book.
I know. It's really, you didn't know it was Amish from the cover or anything. Like, I had to read the summary and I was like, oh, this really is about Amish. Yeah.
Right. So is she like a princess, or what's her title? Does she have a title? I want her to have a title.
She's supposed to have a title, but I'll get to that. She, like a proper Amish girl, denies this title. She's not down with it. So she wakes up. She's been turned by Imogen. Spoiler alert, the vampire queen. She tries to go home. So she returns home. Her parents, at first, they assume she was out all night partying and they're mad at her. But then they noticed her eyes are purple. And that is like the sign you are a vampire, is that your eyes are purple. And so her dad is like, I'm sorry, you can't be here. Vampires are dangerous. So she's sort of shunned. Like, the author for her part didn't call it that, but like her dad's like, you can't be here. She then goes to visit Josiah, who also lived, but he is in the ICU. He's very injured, and the nurses tell him he's not expected to make it. So she's like, well, these vampires saved me. Maybe I can save him. So she decides to drink some of his blood from his hand, and it works, and Josiah makes this miraculous recovery and is discharged. Josiah's parents, though, do not kick him out. And Abby tries to be like, you should stay in the barn with me. Like, let's figure out what we should do. But he's like, no. Anyway, it gets a little gruesome. Josiah kills his parents and his whole family overnight because he can't resist the blood. And then, yeah. And then he feels so bad about it that he goes and stands in the sun. So suicide by. So that's where we are. And then the original vampires that turned her come back. So they send this guy named Cannon. Cannon is sent to find her. He is a bloodbound, which means he is one of Imogen's personal bodyguards. Bloodbounds are bound by blood to the queen.
You don't say.
And they basically roam the countryside looking for rogue vampires and vampires that have been turned. And there's all these underground cave communities of vampires because they can't be in the daylight. So even though they're part of regular society, yada, yada, yada. So Cannon finds Abigail, eventually persuades her to go to their cave community in Virginia. So she gets there and there's vampire school and classes. And she meets two young women her age who have also recently been turned. And she soon stops wearing a bonnet and she cuts her hair. And she's really torn about all this, but her friends are like, well, you're not Amish anymore. And so there's this slow shedding of her Amish identity. So Imogen, soon after Abby arrives, is like, I'm so glad you're here. We need to talk. And like you already predicted, because Imogen turned her, Abby is considered already to be a very strong vampire. So most vampires take it takes 15 bites to turn someone, but people like Imogen and Abby can do it in one bite. Which she realized when she did Josiah. And so Imogen wants Abby to succeed her as the queen of their vampire clan, I guess. And at first she's honored, but then as she watches Imogen in action, Imogen kills people regularly and is very brutal in her tactics. And Abby's like, I can't do that. Like, I don't want to do that kind of violence and have that level of power. And yeah, this was the most interesting part of the book to me, is that she's pretty willing to be like, I'm not wearing a bonnet anymore, but I'm a pacifist. And she tells Imogen, because of what happened with Josiah, she swears she will never bite another human. And so this causes a lot of conflict between her and Imogen. Here's a quote that I pulled out. I was raised to seek peace with everyone, whether they're like me or not, to turn the other cheek when I'm offended, to avoid conflict. I'm not a soldier, and I'm certainly not some kind of general. So,
go Abigail.
Right? Yeah. She knows herself. Though,
I just really hope that it doesn't take her until book 4. Like, I don't know. Like, as an Amish Vampires in Space, I've seen so many things where the pacifism of one character is contingent on the violence of another, or it's viewed as, like, naive, to the point where, like, if you are Amish and then you get married and you leave, it's expected that you're gonna, like, that's one of the things you're gonna drop, because it just doesn't make sense to be a pacifist. As if it wasn't, like, a, you know, pretty important principle that you can carry around even if you don't wear a bonnet.
So the other thing going on, plot-wise, is Reese, the boy. He, of course, this is a YA book. Every YA book has this really deterministic love story. Not my favorite part of YA, dystopian, whatever genre of YA. They're all like this. But anyway, of course, Reese shows up. He has very serious blood poisoning and keeps trying to escape. He's like stuck in vampire solitary confinement, kind of. And she goes and visits him. And eventually he kind of remembers who she is. And he wants her to run away. Like he's like, let's run away together. Let's get out of here. Do our own thing. But then just as Abby's like, yes, we should leave. This is so typical of YA that like kind of bugged me. But yeah, he's like, no, I've changed my mind. I'm going to stay. And it just becomes weird and moody and won't tell her what's going on. So when he finally reveals it, he's of course been persuaded by Imogen to stay and join the Bloodbound, which means he can never have a mate, which is a big deal to Abby because she very much wants to mate with him. And his logic for this decision is really kind of bizarre, but it comes down to, like, Imogen tells him that the only way he can ever be with Abby is to join the Bloodbound because Abby is expected to be her heir, and so, like, he would be Bloodbound to Abby. And so it's really convoluted. They sneak off and make out a few times, but then Reese is always like, no, I don't like you like that, and then it ends with... So the end of the book, Abby's like, don't join the Bloodbound. Like, there's this big initiation ceremony planned, and Abby's like, I have an idea. Like, just promise me you won't do this initiation ceremony until I get back. And he's like, yes, I promise. So during, like, at the start of this initiation ceremony, Abby sneaks off with her 2 girlfriends, and they go to Washington, D.C. to hear this other vampire leader who's doing a sit-in in Washington, D.C.
For vampire rights?
Yes, because that is also a theme, vampire rights. So the vampire leader's name is Sadie, and unlike Imogen, she is a committed pacifist who likes humans and wants to be like working together to all live in peace. And plot twist, she is Imogen's sister, and they hate each other.
Of course.
Of course.
Another beloved YA trope.
Yes. And after hearing Sadie speak, Abby and the 2 other girls, like, they go talk to her, and Sadie's like, come join me. She's headquartered in LA. And they can work for her on like vampire human relations stuff. And they're like, yes, this sounds amazing. So they stop by the cave in Virginia one more time because she's like, Reese, I found us a way out of here, but it's too late. He has joined the Bloodbound, and he's now bound by blood to leave him. Like, he can't leave Imogen. And so they go to LA, and that's kind of where the book leaves. There's an epilogue where like the police show up and arrest them for no apparent reason. I assume something to do with Imogen, but that's where the book ends.
Wow. That is pretty cliffhanger. And come on, Reese. That's so typical. Like, yeah.
She'll only want to be with you if you're her bodyguard. And if you're her bodyguard, then you can't have sex with her. Sorry, mate with her.
Well, they can have sex, but they can't, like, bloodbounds can't mate for life, but they can, like, the queen is like the only person who can produce biological vampire children. So the bloodbound can, I guess, mate in quotes with the queen, but they can't like mate like a couple.
Oh. So now the only way that Abby and Reese can be together is if Abby gives up her pacifism and becomes the violent vampire queen that Imogen wants her to become.
Yes.
Wow. That was a thrill ride.
I like that this, what is she, like 16 or 17 year old? The thing that always gets me in these kind of books is like, yes, I, as the leader of a vampire civil rights movement, will totally hire a 16-year-old to be my intern in LA. I'll just take care of everything. Yeah. So like that I don't know that a 16-year-old ex-Amish vampire girl is really going to help you all that much, but okay.
Yeah. Actually, the fantasy part about that is the idea of paid internships. That's the fantasy.
Paid internships in LA, especially.
In LA, yes. That's the most fantastical idea. Vampires, possible. Paid internships in LA, never.
No way.
Yeah, overall, I downloaded this book and I was like, oh, this is going to be so good to make fun of. But it ended up being, like, good. It was pretty accurate, the Amish pieces. Like, it because it took place more in this vampire community, there wasn't, like, a ton of, like, Amish stuff, I guess. But the stuff that was mentioned, like, you know, little casual things like, I've never danced before when they're at this inauguration or this initiation ceremony. There was a comment about not wearing jewelry. Also, I have to give props to the author for, in like the third paragraph of the book, saying, quote, shunning isn't common. I was like, oh,
hey,
nice.
There was this weird thing where she kept calling Amish communities villages, and whatever, minor thing, but I did find it a little weird. Like, okay, it's not like they all live together and there's no one else around. Like, they're not.
Mm-hmm. And they're pretty spread out because of the farm thing, so it's not like they're all lined up on Main Street. Like, that's weird.
Yeah, I honestly, I think I'll probably read book 2. I'm really curious how this whole like pacifism queen thing will go. And I'm really hoping the author doesn't do the easy thing like what happened in Vampires in Space, where they like compromise on this to like get the plot to go the way they want. So
yeah. Well, I fully support. I think what I want to have happen is I want you to read the rest of the series and then just tell me about all of the other books, because yeah, I'm hooked. I want to know. I just don't want to know maybe enough to read it.
Yeah. So yeah, you can find book 1 for free on Amazon, and unfortunately I couldn't find the others. I'm gonna have to buy them, but yeah.
So Abby, are you gonna do that for us with the other 2 Amish werewolves and zombies?
I mean,
because I'm pretty sure that they're also like 500 pages each.
Give me a little while to like be in the mood for a sci-fi book again, and I might at least consider it. Because I am kind of curious.
I would totally stop.
I mean, the book was not bad. Like, I did want to take a strong editing to it and do some. It didn't need to be 492 pages long. It could have been much shorter and still gotten its main points across. So I did want to edit it. But it was better than I expected. So,
right, Tillie, completely different direction.
Yeah, no vampires in my story, but lots of violence and blood. So some similar themes. I worked only at a section of Punisher comics, of which there are many, and there are multiple universes and incarnations. The storyline that I read was from the 2010 Punisher Max series from Max Comics. It's just a 5-issue arc called The Kingpin. And so I got a text from my brother about this. There's an assassin called the Mennonite. You have to read about it. Obviously, this is too interesting to ignore. And I do spend enough time living in the Marvel universe in my head, or I have, watched the movies and a handful of the shows and read a portion of the comics. So I was like, okay, this is up my alley. And then I read it, and now I'm not so sure it's up my alley anymore. But to sum up, the Punisher is like the superhero name, vigilante name for Frank Castle, who is a former Marine who becomes a vigilante who fights organized crime after his wife and kids are killed in a shootout between rival gangs. And he can't get justice through the justice system because of corrupt cops or something. So he takes matters into his own hand and he gets revenge, and then he just starts fighting crime in New York, mostly in Hell's Kitchen, which is also where Daredevil hangs out, and other villains like Kingpin and Bullseye and other comic booky things. So the Punisher in comics and TV and in the movie is one of the comic book world's most violent characters. And recently his logo, which is this skull, has been, I don't know if I'd say appropriated or just used by far-right militia groups, including QAnon followers and other, independent militias. So major caveat here, this character has been used to the express displeasure of his creator as a really far-right conspiracy theorist, violent responder person. So keep that in mind. And this perception of him is part of why I've never really bothered to watch his TV series or read his comics before. Mm-hmm. But, this is duty. This is my responsibility, and I will do this. Okay, so the actual plot is about the rise of Wilson Fisk, who goes by Kingpin. And our very first scene, we get Frank Castle literally torturing someone with a hacksaw. And then it switches over to this meetup of Italian mafia families, and they're like, we have to take down the Punisher. Let's do that by pretending that there's this new organized crime figure called Kingpin, and have Wilson Fisk pretend to be Kingpin, and we'll lure him in, and then we'll kill him. So a lot of the plot is Castle killing and torturing and maiming his way through organized crime members in attempts to get to the Kingpin, and he's sort of figuring out that the Kingpin is just an act, that the Kingpin's not really real, when one of the mafia dons is like, we're done here, I'm just gonna hire an assassin. And so he hires the Mennonite. And wow. The Mennonite comes from an unnamed Mennonite region, gets in his wagon, drives the wagon into New York City, into Hell's Kitchen. Sure. They have a very long, very bloody fight that ends with Castle winning, sort of barely. And meanwhile, Wilson Fisk, who you think is supposed to be the bodyguard, has hired hits on all of his rivals and becomes the real Kingpin. That's sort of where the story arc ends. And we do get some backstory of the Mennonite, which is an interesting thing to do. I think we get some backstory on Wilson Fisk too, but we don't really get any backstory on like the mafia dons, just Wilson Fisk and the Mennonite. And the Mennonite's name is unknown because when he meets with the mafia don, he says that not everybody needs to know his Christian name, which, as far as I can tell, no Mennonite has ever really cared about. But I guess if he doesn't want his name to be associated with violence, which is stupid because he's willingly taking a hit on somebody. Okay, so it's hinted that the Mennonite was a hitman for the mafia, and then he converted to join a plain dressing Mennonite group because of his wife Mary. And so Mary is sick with something. We don't know what. And the Mennonite wants to take her to a doctor, but this other Mennonite woman tells him he and his family will be excommunicated if he takes her to a doctor. So the Mennonite's like, well, I'll do it anyway, but I don't have money to pay for the doctor. So he sits down and he prays for a sign from God, and then his son comes up to him and is like, there's this guy with an Italian name who wants to talk to you. And it turns out that his former mob boss wants him to kill somebody. And he's like, this is a sign from God. It will give me the money to take my wife to the doctor. And he accepts the hit and he says, quote, if the good Lord wills it, it will be done. And then he is offered a gun with which to kill the Punisher, and he says, quote, he will only use the tools that his religion allows. So he's not going to fight the Punisher with a gun. He's going to fight the Punisher with his fists, a sledgehammer, an axe, and his horses.
Oh, Lord.
Oh, my.
And at one point he mentions that it is God's will that he will kill this man. And so this fight goes on, and it's agonizing, and it's very bloody and very explicit. And the Mennonite is electrocuted, and on his deathbed says, "Oh God, what have I done?" and apologizes to his wife, and then his head is smashed in by Frank Castle.
Wow.
That is something.
That's what I thought also.
He was in the mob, and then he left the mob because he married a Mennonite woman?
That's the hint. His wife saved him. We don't know how precisely, but it's implied that I don't know, maybe he just fell in love and that was enough to get him out of the situation, or maybe he had a crisis of conscience and converted and then fell. There's no real detail.
That would make more sense than just being in the mob and randomly running into a plain Mennonite group and somehow, marrying them.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to know, he's middle-aged here. He's got 2 boys with his wife, Mary, and they're, I don't know, not quite tweens yet. So he's been in this community for a while, which, I don't know, maybe they met on her Rumspringa, which implies that he was either older when they met, or he was, a really young hitman. I don't... I'm trying to, work up the ages and dates and lines and not coming up with much.
I'm also struck by, if we lived in a country with universal health care, he wouldn't have needed to rejoin the mob and become a killer. He could have just taken his wife to the doctor.
That's a good point. Well, I wonder how many assassins would not be assassins today if we had universal health care. It's a good point.
Probably a lot.
Yeah.
I think Biden should get on that.
You're solving problems.
Yeah. So as far as accuracy goes, this had a lot of issues. Comics are a visual medium, and the clothing was not quite right. His hat needed to look a little bit less like a fedora made of straw and more like a straw boater. And also, I know of no plain group, Amish or Mennonite, that forbids you from seeing a doctor. Literally all the Mennonite wants to do is take his wife to a doctor. And considering that most plain groups have some form of mutual aid community payment for these things, he should absolutely be able to take his wife to a doctor and find out what is going on with his wife, and probably pay for treatment if it's treatable. And in fact, the community will support him in this, not excommunicate him. But I guess once he's told that he'll be excommunicated, he's just well, fine, I'll be excommunicated, because he's willing to find money and take money from a hit to save his wife. But if he's willing to compromise his morals, to that extent, but weirdly not to the full extent, he's willing to commit violence and kill someone and take his wife to a doctor, but he's not willing to do it with a gun. It seems pretty arbitrary. And also he drives a wagon, not even a buggy, a wagon to New York City, and you see him in traffic in a wagon. And I'm just do they not know that public transport is a thing and that Mennonites can use that? Also, slightly less related accuracy thing, I'm pretty sure that you can't train horses to respond to trample people by whistling for them. I may not know enough about horses to do that. Maybe horses are very trainable and are willing to trample people when you whistle for them, because that's what happens. Frank Castle gets trampled by horses. So there's some issues. Yeah, I really do want to emphasize just how violent this is, because for someone who won't use a gun, the Mennonite is just brutal. And Frank Castle is brutal. So over the course of these 5 issues, we see a man getting tortured with a hacksaw, someone's head being squeezed so his eyeballs pop out. Lots of bullets through heads, like sort of side references to rape, snap necks, broken fingers, someone gets a knife to the crotch, someone else gets electrocuted, horses trampling Frank Castle, the horses then being exploded with dynamite, someone being strangled, off-screen shooting of a child, and then a very heavy safe is dropped on the Mennonite's head.
Ugh.
So it's very bloody, and just really in my head I was just like, none of this makes any sense for any. If he was a Mennonite, he was never a very good one, because he clearly had like not a good understanding of what connotated violence. If his only thought of violence was gun and not like horse trampling, then I think he's severely traumatized from a lifetime in the mafia and also demented and needs some help. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm glad I didn't read that. It sounds,
Yeah, not my cup of tea.
Yeah, neither.
Yeah, to be honest, I would not recommend it. I didn't think that the art was particularly interesting. I didn't think the only characters who got any development were the Kingpin, and I think they assume by this point in the story arc you already know who Frank Castle is and you sympathize with him, but I didn't sympathize with him at all because I hadn't read the other comics. And so I was like, this is just a horrible man who tortures people with hacksaws. And they tried to give the Mennonite some depth, but for me it just like fell flat on its face. It was like, I can't take him seriously. Like, I can't respect this man as someone who's tough or respect him as someone who like has convictions, because they're such arbitrary convictions.
Mm-hmm.
So like, yeah, if I had to rate it like 1 out of 5 sledgehammers, I guess.
Oh, do we each get to pick our own rating scale? I like that.
Ooh, I like that too.
I think we do. What are your ultimate conclusions?
Well, I guess I can go first. Yeah, I think I ended up with a solid, I think 3 out of 5 exploding suns. We'll say exploding suns. So I think like my biggest issue with this book was the horror dimensions. I've read other vampire books, but I just didn't like the kind of parts of vampire that he really played up in this book, and the long slog of the first 70% of the book.
Wow.
Once it kind of shifted into like there was a clearer objective and the vampires weren't hidden, and it was like the lines between the vampires and the surviving humans were a little more clear. It was faster, a little more enjoyable to read, but there was some real issues with how pacifism was viewed as just a inconvenient thing that needed to be persuaded out of people. So that I think knocks it down a little bit. And yeah, the fact that it was almost 500 pages long. I don't think it needs to be that long. That said, it was a solidly written book, and it was, I enjoyed parts of it, and the world was at least a little bit, it had some interesting ideas. So if I would maybe, I would recommend it. I think if you are into sci-fi already, this could be a fun read, possibly. I would give it, to get through the first half takes a while, so that's the slog. But yeah, so I'd say 3 out of 5 exploding suns.
Yeah, I might give Crimsonborn, might go 4 out of 5 blood oaths. Like, I don't know what to rate it. My one concern / annoyance with the book was just this whole like very common thing that happens in YA books where this person you meet, like, I don't know, like the first person you ever kiss is your destiny type stuff that I don't like. And there was a lot of very explicit everything happens for a reason talk, and that's not, I guess, theology or a life mantra that I get behind. I think sometimes things just happen and they're crappy and they don't happen for a reason. But Anyway, that's a common thing in YA, so it's hard to ding this book too much for that. And overall, I thought it was a really entertaining plot with some interesting tensions, and it was not 500 pages long or overly violent. So, I kind of liked it. Yeah, so I think if you liked Twilight, you'd probably like Crimson Born. I can't say I really liked Twilight. I think I may have liked this more than Twilight. I don't know. The Amish stuff was interesting to me. So, yeah.
Nice.
Close this out, Tillie.
Well, that takes us to the end of this eclectic episode of Just Plain Wrong. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back next week. Please, if you haven't already, follow us on social media. We are on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook under Plain Wrong Pod. Send us emails, commenting on individual episodes, giving us Mennonite moments, just saying hi. We'd love to hear from you.